The Andes Mountains in South America, home to the world's tallest volcanoes. In 1999, an amazing discovery was made here. The frozen mummy of a young girl. She looks peaceful, like she died yesterday. But this girl lived centuries ago and holds a dark secret about a lost civilization. Mummies, time travelers from the past. Who were they in life? Where did they come from? And how did they die? All will give up their secrets to Mummies Alive, the Museum of High-Altitude Archaeology and Argentina, complete with a state-of-the-art cryopreservation lab. This facility was built 10 years ago to house one of the greatest discoveries ever made in the Americas. A unique mummy from the past that left scientists stone. A girl who appears to be asleep, but she has been like this for centuries, perfectly frozen in time. The mummy was uncovered in the Indian mountains of South America, on the lonely, snow-capped peak of the world's tallest active volcano, Mount Llullaillaco. The year was 1999, and a high-altitude archaeological excavation was underway. Leading the team was explorer and anthropologist Dr. Johann Reinhardt. All of a sudden, I heard this guy cry out, "Mummy!" They had discovered the highest tomb on Earth. We're at 22,000 feet. When she first came out of the ground, she was completely wrapped up. We couldn't see any part of her body, but the textiles were just outstanding, and they were so well preserved. But the biggest surprise came when they removed her ravines, taking off the cloth and the girl. We had to talk, we had to communicate, do this, do that. It was in a hushed voice, and it was as if we were afraid at some level that we might wake this mummy up, because she seemed just so alive. But nothing had the impact of when we uncovered her hands. Probably one of the most powerful experiences I've had in my life. Because those hands were perfect, we realized that this has got to be, if not the best preserved mummy in the world, we don't know of any other better. And preserved along with her a spectacular collection of artifacts, ceramics, figurines, and textiles. Everything seemed totally untouched. It was perfectly preserved. Nothing, not a feather, it's strong. Not a color that faded the archaeologist's dream. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to bury this girl in an extraordinary place. Now a neck of investigators will attempt to decipher these objects, examine her body, and unravel the mysteries of this mummy. The first question, when did she die? The items in her tomb revealed the remarkable truth. They may look brand new, but archaeologists date them to over 500 years ago, remnants of a legendary civilization, the Inca. The statues that were with her, the ceramics that were with her, everything was from the Inca Empire. This girl is a human link to the great empire that dominated South America in the 15th century, famous for building Machu Picchu. The Inca are cloaked in mystery, wiped out by Spanish conquest. They left no written language, so this girl is a rare and valuable glimpse into a lost civilization. Today she is conserved under the watchful eye of Gabriella Riccardo Browning. For me, the Maiden is not only a scientific object, she is a young woman that I love. I think that one of my missions in life is to take care of her. Effectively known as the Maiden, this mummy attracts visitors from all over the world, but some are not prepared for what they see. When people hear meet the Maiden, sometimes they get very shocked. They cry, or they get sad, because it's difficult to understand the death of this maiden, of this girl, an Inca girl buried 500 years ago on top of a volcano. Her corpse is strange. Seed didn't slump. She looks like she slept to her death. But in order to really understand what happened, investigators need to take a closer look at her body. Today we're going to take her up. We're going to see her face to face. Very rarely the curators open this cryopreservation capsule designed to keep her frozen at a constant -4 degrees Fahrenheit. When she does come out, time is of the essence. They move fast. She is so delicate that an autopsy is out of the question, but a CT scan would provide a forensic look inside. She's going out of the museum for the first time, because we are doing a CT scan on her body. We really don't know what these images are going to show us. She travels in a freezer, at night, when temperatures are lowest, and arriving at the local hospital, She becomes the oldest outpatient to pass through their CT scan. Using the images captured, forensic pathologist Dr. Richard Shepherd can begin to uncover her secrets. One of the key questions that we have to answer is, how old was the maiden? And one of the ways we can look at that is to look at her teeth. The third molars, the so-called wisdom teeth, are still present in her jaw, and that tells me that she is a teenager. In fact, measurements of her long bones reveal she is just 14 years old. As a pathologist, I do have to examine babies and children and teenagers, and it's quite hard to examine those because these are people at the start of their life rather than the end of it, and the commonest cause of death in a modern teenager is either trauma or drugs. Perhaps this ancient teenager suffered a traumatic accident on the mountain. Broken bones could provide a vital clue. Looking at the skeleton, I can see that there's no evidence of any fractures, nothing to suggest that she suffered any significant trauma that could have caused her death. The mysterious cases like this, understanding how the body was found, where it was found, are important bits of information that can give really valuable clues to understanding how someone died. The mysterious case of the maiden began with a body in a desolate place, eroded inhospitable. Today, Mount Llullaillaco is a 10-hour drive from the nearest 9. It is so remote that modern men didn't even attempt to climb it until 60 years ago. But somehow, the maiden ended up here 4 centuries earlier. We're talking about the 1400s. We're talking about before Columbus reached America. These were times when trying to reach these altitudes, 22,000 feet, was just beyond even the thought capacity of man. Who was this girl? And what was she doing here? The mountain itself may hold the key. Frozen in time for 500 years, this girl is the best preserved mummy in the world. The key to her preservation lies in where she was found buried in the highest tomb on Earth, on the peak of a remote volcano. The process of freezing by itself is very, very good at preserving a body. But if a body is placed at high altitude, where the oxygen levels are lower, then that's going to add to that preservation of the body. But what was a teenage girl doing on top of Arkino? Modern-day forensic pathologist Dr. Richard Shepherd has investigated hundreds of suspicious deaths. His first step is determining how her body got there. I know from my own experience that moving body is very difficult indeed. They're not simple things to manhandle. Figuring out if she walked up the mountain herself, or if her body was carried up, might hold the key to whether or not her death was in accident. I'm particularly interested in the position in which the maiden was found. Putting her into that position would have to be done in a short period after death, because of a change that naturally occurs called rigor mortis, the stiffening of the muscles that happens after death. So logically, she has to have died very close to her burial site and been placed in the position that we see her now. The maiden died close to where she was buried. This means she may have been alive on the summit, and this could be the key to her demise, because it's over 22,000 feet. The summit of Llullaillaco is in what many people call the death zone. Up here, the air contains 50% less oxygen than at sea level. Dr. Marcelo Parada spends his life climbing mountains to rescue the dying and recover the dead. We did recover bodies of the mountaineers that just slept to the death. They were just kind of peaceful, but they were frozen. The maiden isn't the only sleeping corpse to be pulled from a mountain. So what is it about that environment that makes a person curl up, go to sleep, and die? If you've been there in this kind of environment, you feel awful. Even in our times with best equipment, this is a very difficult task, and it's very demanding. Imagine climbing in that thin air. This is an amazing task to do for a 14-year-old girl. But Marcelo doesn't believe the maiden died because of extreme altitude. He believes she may have fallen victim to another killer on the mountain. It's going to be about 30-20 Celsius below zero. That's very, very cold. And it's also most of the time very windy. We did hypothermia very quickly. A morning clothing isn't enough to prevent hypothermia and that environment. Imagine clothing 500 years ago. Hypothermia, also known as the sweet death, because of the expression that leaves low of many of its victims' frozen faces. Some people look peaceful when they die, but it's like turning off slowly. It makes you just go to sleep and eventually freeze. peaceful, sleeping and frozen, like the Maiden. It looks like hypothermia could have been her killer. Dr. Shepard searches her CT scans for confirmation. Hypothermia affects the whole of the body, but the changes are best seen in the feet and in the stomach. And we can count all of the 5 bones of both feet, showing that there is no obvious evidence of frostbite, now or in the past. If we look at the stomach, the changes that occurred during hypothermia are very superficial ulcers on the lining of the stomach. I can't see any in the Maiden's case, and so I have nothing to suggest to me that she died from hypotherm. But something else in her stomach catches Dr. Shepard's arm. I'm really rather surprised to see that there's actually some food in her stomach, and there's fecal material in her bowel. So she's been eating and drinking to within 2 hours of her death, and that really does point towards a pretty sudden, unnatural death, rather than a prolonged process. Why would someone eat a meal on a mountain and then mysteriously drop dead just hours later? With investigators baffled, a new expert is called in. He has an unusual way of extracting information from mummies. If you've got good preservation of the hair, you have information that's been frozen in time. Bioarchaeologists, Dr. Andrew Wilson, may be able to crack the case by analyzing chemicals in the Maiden's hair. We can use those chemicals to establish essentially a timeline that takes us back through the final month and years of their existence. He cuts a sample from her head for analysis. Studying the chemicals in her hair may provide extraordinary details about the Maiden's health, behavior, and even what she was eating. The results are in. Dr. Wilson identifies a significant shift in her diet just 3 months before she died. She's consuming easily preserved foods, slightly, the mazed and freeze triant, laminate. It's a big clue. Her hair contains traces of 2 foods that were common staples for ancient Inca or travels. Archaeologists have found a vast network of highways and trails throughout the Incan Empire, and dotted along them, remains of waste stations once stopped with corn and jerky. Exactly what the Maiden was on in her final months. The chemical signatures in her hair effectively point to a journey to the mountains for those last few months. If Dr. Wilson is right, the 14-year-old Maiden made a mysteriously long journey before she died. But why would she travel for months to reach this remote peak? For anthropologist Johann Reinhardt, the answer lies in the special role mountains have always played in Indian culture. Mountains are considered sacred in the Andes because rivers come down from the mountains. The mountains seem to be controlling the weather because the clouds gather around them. A mountain worship is still extremely active today to traditional communities throughout the Andes. We give gratitude to Mother Earth because from her we receive so much. Huma is a modern-day shaman who has been climbing mountains to make offerings since the age of 6. So he doesn't find it strange that an ancient Inca girl would be found in such a place. For thousands of years, people would give offerings in seeds and coca cakes. For the Inca, mountains were religious places where they went to make offerings. And according to Johann, as the tallest volcano in the region, Llullaillaco was special. Llullaillaco would have been in control at the fertility of the crops, the fertility of the livestock, and Incas wanted to get into the realm of the gods, though they did this incredible pilgrimage to Llullaillaco. It looks like the Maiden was here for religious reasons. The volcanoes represent the womb of Mother Earth. The girls represent that feminine essence. So that's why they would go through the volcano. But if the Maiden was on a sacred pilgrimage, why didn't she come back down, with no signs of trauma or hypothermia? Investigators are at a closer look at her body for clues. I'm looking at some bulge on her cheek. It seems that she has something in her mouth. When we look at the internal scans of the X-rays, we can see that there's actually something sat between the teeth on the left side and her cheek. Could this be something that's been pushed through her mouth? It's actually caused her death. And what is the material that this is made of? All of these things raise great suspicions now in my mind as to why the Maiden died. 500 years ago, this girl made a long pilgrimage to a sacred volcano. Despite her young age, she climbed to a colossal height. But upon reaching the summit, she appears to have curled up and drowned. At this point, the death of the Maiden is still very much a mystery. And when we look at a death of a teenager, I've got no evidence of any natural disease, and there's no that she suffered any form of trauma. At a loss to explain her death, Dr. Shepherd looks beyond the autopsy table, just like he would with the death of a modern teenager. The next thing I'm going to be thinking of is drugs, and so I would naturally send off samples for analysis in the toxicology lab. It may seem odd to search for drugs in the body of an ancient girl, but Dr. Andrew Wilson is doing just that, and the results are remarkable. We found the presence of cocaine, this chemical compound in her hair. Cocaine in the body of an ancient teenager. But she's a relatively young girl, and so body mass or physiology are important considerations. But the levels that we're seeing are very high, an increasing concentration in the last 12 months of her life. On the surface, it's a startling discovery, but according to Andrew, this isn't a case of ancient narcotics. It's not cocaine as we know in terms of the modern connotation to this, the bad connotations. It's simply the chemical compounds that are derived directly from coca leaves. The drug we know today as cocaine didn't exist until 400 years after the Maiden died. Its natural source is the coca leaf, a plant native to the Indians. Cultivated and consumed ritual and medicinal purposes for thousands of years, it is still used today. It's our meal, it's our medicine, and it's our oracle. Many chew it as a stimulant to help with long journeys in altitude sickness, and the telltale sign is a bulge in their teeth, just like the Maiden. It looks like this is the mystery object in her mouth. And if it is, according to Shaman Puma, this reveals something about who she was. In those times, not everybody was allowed to chew coca leaves. They had to be part of a royalty, or a part of a spiritual circle. Puma suspects the Maiden was no ordinary girl. She was someone important, and a closer look at the objects in her tomb suggests he may be right. This tunic was found with the Maiden. She had it on her right shoulder, but is a typical male garment. So maybe her father offered these to the gods. Maybe he was there when she was buried. These little squares are a kind of symbolic code, the brotherhood between two regions in the Inca state. That could be indicated that he was a local coraca, a local governor, or maybe related with the Inca emperor, a tantalizing clue connecting the Maiden to Inca nobility, possibly even an emperor himself, and a sign her father may have been with her on the journey, and perhaps part of the final barrier. Her story is slowly taking shape, and her grave reveals more. Ceramics, that point to where she came here from. This ceramic is very special. The decoration is typical from Cusco. This ceramic came with the Maiden from Cusco. Today, Cusco is a bustling city, popular with tourists, but 500 years ago it was the capital of the largest empire on earth, as big as Europe's greatest city at the time, and home to the Inca emperor. We can picture the Inca Empire being like a wheel with the roads being the spokes that lead out in all as different parts of the empire. The center, the axle, is Cusco. That's where you have the focus of the governmental power, but also religious power. Under this Spanish church are the ruins of the most sacred inane sanctuary. The Coricancia, which means courtyard of gold. We can imagine what the Coricancia must have looked like when the Spanish came, because it was covered with these plates of gold. This gold, when the sun hit it, was glittering to such an extent that they say that some people were blinded. Gold, the color of the sun. The Inca worshipped the sun, and their religion stretched beyond these walls. In fact, the Inca tried to get as close as possible to the sun itself by climbing the highest peaks they could find, like Mount Llullaillaco, where the Maiden was found. This may be the route that the Maiden would have begun walking when she left Cusco, and 1,000 miles in that direction lies Mount Llullaillaco. The Inca had no wheel or horse. They traveled on foot. The Maiden's route took her through some extreme environments, including a desert, so arid and devoid of life that parts of it had been compared to Mars and the Moon. This is the world's driest desert. Even the Spanish were saying the only people you find vattle out in these deserts are outlaws or crazy people. This is a very long pilgrimage, and at the end of it she then has to climb a peak whose altitude was not even reached until 400 years later by Europeans. It's a pretty phenomenal thing for a 13-14-year-old girl to have done. A clearer picture of this mummy is emerging. A 14-year-old girl with ties to the capital and maybe even the emperor himself, a girl who walked a great distance through perilous landscapes. But this journey ended in her death. So investigators are looking for new evidence to help understand what happened. Studies on the teeth of the maiden showed that they are very worn down, so that may be an indicator that she was very stressed and also tense in this pilgrimage from Cusco to Llullaillaco, and another disturbing clue, vomit on her lips. We know that the maiden vomit maybe just some minutes before she died. Some theories say that the romance indicates stress or fear. Was the maiden afraid on the mountain top? And if so, of what? Investigators are piecing together the life of this 500-year-old young mummy. Potter links her to the empire's capital, Cusco. A tunic suggests she was the daughter of a local chief, and cocoa leaves place her in an important spiritual circle. But there's one item that stands out above the rest, a beautiful headdress, the finest ever found in an extraordinary state of preservation. This headdress is the kind of crown. Its shins are like a princess. For Incas, feathers are more important than gold. For Gabriella, this headdress provides the final piece of the puzzle. This kind of headdress were used only for special ceremonies and mainly for virgins of the sun. Virgins of the sun were famous throughout the Inca Empire. Chronicles record that a special group were chosen each year to serve the sun. Some could be of a fairly young age.
It could be 6 to 8 years, some maybe 10 years. The beauty was one of the reasons for selecting them, and in some cases, even their parents might have offered them to become part of
the service of the Inca religion. As a virgin of the sun, the maiden would have been separated from her family, never to return home. Pottery from her tomb suggests she was brought to Cusco, and Johann is here to pick up her trail. This is the place where the virgins of the sun were kept. The so-called Akawasi, considered incredibly sacred to the Incas. If the maiden were in Cusco, she would have been kept behind these walls and seclusion where there were no windows. These buildings were especially designed to keep them apart in order to keep them pure. The maiden lives a cloistered existence. Part nun, part priestess, preparing sacred offerings for the sun god. Rarely is she allowed out. So why does she leave this place to make a 1,000-mile pilgrimage to a distant mountain? At a certain point, these virgins of the sun would be allocated their duties. In essence, we are destined to have. Some would be selected to be conquered by the Inca nobility, and a very select few, would be selected as offerings as human sacrifice. The maiden didn't go to Mount Llullaillaco to make an offering. She was the offering, singled out by her own people for human sacrifice. Different kind of qualities were taken into consideration as to which child would be selected. They had to have some kind of a charisma about them. They wouldn't have a child who was easily frightened. For the Inca, being chosen for sacrifice was a great privilege, and in Cusco, the maiden would have been treated as a goddess. She would have not her very special ceremonies in the presence of the Inca, and for herself, and then a very highly honored. She left Cusco in a blaze of glory, and the fame followed her all the way to the volcano. We think that she wore this headdress when she was walking to her final destiny. Maybe when she walked through different towns, she was wearing this beautiful headdress that indicates that she was the chosen one to be offered to the gods. But under all the glory, there is a better truth. A 14-year-old girl walking 1,000 miles, knowing that she is going to die. Very difficult for a one to understand this. Maybe her beliefs helped her to accept her destiny, but for me, I think for every woman now, this century is very hard to imagine. The situations, in our capture language, there is no word sacrifice. The correct word is offering. So we don't have human sacrifices, we have human offerings. The principle was, this life, this Mother Earth, God created all for you. So what can you give back in gratitude? It can only give you life. So how did she give her life? Was it a violent ritual for a peaceful departure? No signs of violence have been found on the maiden's body. So in the search for answers, investigators will turn to other mummies, other human offerings found on mountains. some of whom met a terrible fate. 500 years ago, this Inca girl's life ended in a mysterious ritual. She was taken up a volcano and offered to the gods, and she wasn't the only one. Over the last century, more than 35 Inca human offerings have been found on an Indian peaks. Dr. Johann Reinhard discovered 18 of them, and they were all children. I think one of the things that is difficult for Westerners understand is why children, and from the Inca perspective, it had to be children. Why? Because they are pure. Because of their purity, the deed has accepted them. For the Inca, this wasn't just death, a killing of a child. This was in fact an immortalizing of a child. So how were these immortalizing rituals carried out? Chronicles tell us that it was very common to use violence in this kind of sacrifice. This young victim, just 7 years old, was found on an Arquido south of Mount Llullaillaco. Some people say that their expression is of pain. Yes, its mouth, like open in a big shout. In the right part of her back, she has a clear wound, a clear injury, and indicates how she died. She was stopped with this fear, but CT scans of the Maiden reveal no violent injuries, and she died with a peaceful expression on her face. So what happened to her on the mountain? Using the evidence in her tomb, and with the help of chronicles written after the fall of the empire, investigators pieced together her final moments. One good possibility is that they timed the sacrifice to take place the morning following the December solstice, December 21st, with the first sunrise. The priests themselves would have been burning incense, making offerings. They say that our soul, before leaving the body and crossing the lake of life, needs a lot of vitality. So we had ceremonies to restrink in the soul, with these sacred plants, with these cocoa leaves, with the chicha. Chicha was a cornfield fed to victims before their death. A chicha cub survives intact in the Maiden's grave, and Dr. Wilson finds high levels of alcohol in her system, which combined with the cocoa leaves would have had mind-altering effect. For me, what I find so spine-tingling is for sure there's a sedating effect. From the alcohol, the male also have been with the cocoa in her system hallucination as well. And these are the effects that it brought about to effectively control her, and perhaps even her family. The male tunic suggests her father may have been with her on the mountain. Perhaps he watched her being prepared for offering. Chronicles say that when the time came, it was a sin for families or victims to show remorse. Some say that these ceremonies must have been very happy events, and it was an honor for the kiddo. But I think that it must have been traumatic. All over her body are clues as to her final hours. On her cheeks, traces of red pigment, ritual paint. Her braids are so tight that they must have been woven just hours before she died. And on her lips, vomit, perhaps a sign of fear in her final moments. It's so difficult for us to go back in time and imagine what it would have been, like to be in her shoes or in her moccasins, as it were. Surely there's a lot of fear that could have been a tremendous reaction to seeing the place that she was going to be interred and buried in. At sunrise, her short life ended, and she was offered to the gods. But the ritual doesn't seem to have left its mark. Pathologist Dr. Shepard has examined many young murder victims and is weighing up the evidence for the Maiden using CT scans. The possibility of strangulation must exist in a situation like this, with a young person dead in a strange environment, but there's no damage to the muscle of the neck, and there's no damage to this complex group of laryngeal cartilages that can be clearly at this point, present in her neck, uninjured. The Maiden wasn't strangled. Her death remains a mystery. But the investigation isn't over, because according to chronicles, there was another way children were sacrificed. Some were buried alive. Mountain rescue doctor Marcelo Parada has seen this sort of death before in the victims of avalanches. They were buried for quite a long time, 4 or 5 hours, and when we dug them out, they were dead, hypothermic, and they had vomit around their mouth. The Maiden does have vomit on her lips, so was this her terrible fate? Depressed, buried her alive as an offering to the gods. When someone's buried alive, there's always that struggle to escape from the sun. material that's pinning them down, so there's evidence of movements of a hand, sometimes which damage to the nose and the intermix. Look at the maiden. I don't see any evidence at all to suggest that she was buried alive. Your hand, Reinhardt, was one of the first people to lay eyes on her tomb after it's sealed 500 years earlier. There's no sense of struggle in the tomb itself. All the items that are around her look like they have been disturbed. She herself looks like she hasn't been terribly disturbed. Hands went over the other. If somebody's struggling, would you have their hands like this? Doesn't seem very likely. Looking back at his discovery now, Reinhardt believes that the murder weapon may have been staring him in the face. One of the first things he had to remove from her body was that thick wool and cloth pulled over her entire head and knotted tightly at the back. Once you have cloth wrapped around your head and your mouth at 22,000 feet, throughout a breath of media, she could have asphyxiated if she was highly intoxicated with alcohol. Marcelo agrees that it wouldn't have taken much to smother the maiden, given her condition. There is a point where intoxicated people, their brain is so compromised, they wouldn't even swallow. Perhaps the alcohol was administered to help ease her journey out of this world and into the next. In a situation of low oxygen, when the person is in altitude incapacitated through drugs or alcohol, it's likely they're going to succumb far more quickly than where they don't see it. Having weighed up all the evidence, Dr. Shepard delivers his final verdict. Having considered all of the facts, I think suffocation is a very likely cause of death for the maiden. For 500 years, the Inca maiden has guarded the secrets of how she died. Now the truth is revealed. A gentle suffocation to send her to the gods. I don't think she's suffered. She wasn't aware of it. That's what alcohol does. You're kind of isolated from the environment. We think that the maiden died peacefully. In this case, there are low presence of violence. You can see in her face that she rests in peace. When the Inca offered this child to the gods, they believed she would live forever, eternally young, immortalized in her glorious sacrifice. That is what Gabriella wants to believe too. I prefer to think of her as a goddess, and that is happy in some way. Traumatic happiness, but happiness at least. The alternative is to sad,